Make your way back this way. Everybody stretch your legs a little bit. Do we need to do some stretching exercises? Everybody raise one hand up real high. All right, other hand real high. There you go. We're doing some stretching exercises. Hold your leg up. Do something. Do a squat up and down. Carolyn, can you do that? Jumping jacks? No. Can't. Okay, they're holding you up. There you go. Well, hey, listen, anytime during this, if your legs get restless or anything like that, feel free to stand up, walk around. We'll just make this just real, what's the word I'm looking for? Fun. I don't know. Just be encouraged just to do what you need to do and take the time to do that. We're going to open up with some questions, so you can ask me, and I'll do my best to answer them. And then Dr. Clary will come and correct me in that. How many of you have enjoyed this so far? You're grateful for Dr. Clary, just his knowledge, and just amazing how God just works everything out. We knew he was full of wisdom, but even more so, I'm just amazed, and it just helps me grow in my faith and my love for the Lord. So we have some questions. I think we got our first question right here. And so we'll open up with a question. You okay with that? All right, we'll open up with some questions and go. All right. And then we'll switch to the flood. So.
Well, the Ice Age.
I'm sorry, Ice Age.
Right. But it's part of the flood.
Part of the flood.
We'll see, it really was part of the flood.
Well, Pastor, you can't answer this one, so don't worry about it.
I can answer this?
No, you can't.
Okay, good.
I remember being taught many years ago that in physics there's always an equal and opposite reaction to something. And I personally have been intrigued by Mauna Kea as the largest mountain on Earth, even though a lot of it is submerged. And when you were talking about the creation of the seafloor, that's what brought the question to my mind. I have, by myself, equated Mauna Kea to the Marianas Trench. But is the Marianas Trench the reciprocal to the Himalayas, or is it possible that with the Marianas Trench and Mauna Kea and Himalayas being created somewhat simultaneously?
Right, they kind of formed somewhat simultaneously because you have subduction going on the Western Pacific, all these areas where you have those big trenches. You have the oldest ocean crust, which is really 20,000 feet deep below sea level going into the Marianas Trench. So it's some of the oldest ocean crust that still survives. That's why that's the deepest trench. It's 36,000 feet below sea level at the bottom of that trench. So it's much, it's 10,000 foot deeper than Mount Everest is high above sea level. But the volcanic activity that formed, the whole ocean crust also formed the Hawaiian Islands. And then there's a mystery to how they formed. There had to be some extra magma coming up, what they might call a mantle plume or something like that. As the plate moved over it, of course, it left a trail of volcanoes behind. But the volcanoes don't really appear until the last, few islands. And the current big island is still active where Mauna Kea is. That's still active, still oozing lava, occasionally erupting, but it's not explosive. It's a different type of magma than what you get at Mount St. Helens. So subduction volcanoes, the Aleutian Islands, the Marianas Islands, most of the islands we see in these arcs all over the earth, those are subduction volcanoes. They're a completely different chemistry because you're redistilling the ocean crust. And so you're only melting off minerals that are the lowest melting point, and it creates a more explosive magma. Whereas the Hawaiian Islands are coming directly from the mantle. They're a little different chemistry, but I think that stuff can happen more quickly than we thought. You can build up huge volcanoes very, very quickly. I think most of that took place during the receding phase. At least those islands did, but people can't imagine because they're taught that everything was slow and methodical and, that whole uniformitarianism. And so it's hard for people to imagine that volcanoes can form very quickly in the matter of months with the right amount of magma. But it's all about the conditions.
Thank you.
But thank you. Yes, young lady. This is a ringer question, isn't it? It's a ringer.
So, in the Bible, it said that Cain killed Abel and he was banished, right? So I was wondering if Cain started like the caveman.
That's a good question, whether Cain started the caveman. Cain, people ask us all the time, where did Cain get his wife? it was obviously one of his relatives, close relatives, maybe not his sister, but maybe one of his nieces or something like that. So there were people that went with him, obviously, but I don't believe he was really necessarily a caveman, so to speak. I think we get this idea of cavemen during the Ice Age, when humans had to repopulate the earth and they had to find temporary housing, and many of them found caves and started living in those caves because it was ready-made housing as they spread out from the Tower of Babel. So I don't think he would really be and whatever is all that pre-flood civilization, I think, was completely wiped out. So we have no evidence of any human inhabitants or dwellings or buildings in the pre-flood world. Those are all post-flood. So that's an interesting question. Thank you.
How come all the fish didn't die, like the ones that Noah didn't bring on the ark?
Right. Not all the fish died. Some of the fish that got caught up in the tsunami waves, of course, were dragged in. But most tsunami waves zip across the ocean. They are big waves. They don't affect most of the critters living in the ocean. But if you get too close to land, you get washed into land. And so we think that there are a lot of marine animals that did die in the flood. And a lot of that is to leave us evidence that we can observe to show the flood did spread across all the land, mixing those land and marine fossils in. But there are a lot of environments that were destroyed in the flood, like a lot of those pre-flood shallow seas. And so there's lots of animals like trilobites and many of our brachiopods and many of the corals that lived in these unique environments, maybe unique chemistry to the water, that were destroyed in the flood. And God never promised he would save all those marine fossils, marine types, but he did save a lot of fish. There's still a lot of fish in the oceans. There's all sorts of corals in the ocean. But I think he destroyed some of those original environments in the process of the flood, and that basically wiped out a lot of types of marine critters. But he didn't promise to save 2 of every kind of marine critter. But there's a lot of marine critters. That's a good question, too. You guys are thinking. I'm still asleep. I'll wake up at noon.
Good morning. So I'm a homeschool mom, and I just wanted to thank you for just being here and helping us teach our kids and fill in the gaps when it's hard to. My question is just one gap in my head that I can't fill in, and it has to do with the dinosaurs. Did they go on the ark with Noah, or
Yes.
where did that go?
Yes, they did. 2 of every kind. And last night I talked about, I think there's only about 60 kinds of dinosaurs, and God probably brought juveniles of every kind. So there's a growth spurt to dinosaurs, like every animal. Like teenagers, you guys grow really quick and eat 4 pizzas a day. You're getting close. And you'll see they just don't stop eating, especially boys. And dinosaurs were the same way. You know, as they were young, they didn't eat as much, and then they went through a growth spurt. And they kind of can count bone rings for a little bit. There's some, at a point they lose track of that. But it looks like a lot of dinosaurs went through the growth spurt at age 4 to 6. T-Rexes maybe a little later, 13 to 15. So if you brought them on when they're young, before that growth spurt, they won't eat as much. They don't take as much room. There's plenty of room on the ark for all those animals. We talk about that in my dinosaur book in there a little more carefully, if you want more details on that. But if you guys have questions about anything that we don't get to answer today, you come up with questions, feel free to go to ICR.org and you can do a search. There's a lot of articles we've written in there over the years that may answer those questions, or you can even contact us. And those contacts eventually stumble down to the scientists, and if I don't lose it in all my emails I get every day, I'll try to answer some of those every so often. We do try to answer those. We do our best. But you can actually, you guys are spoiled because you live in the Dallas metro area. You can, when our Discovery Center opens back up again, once you have to stop wearing masks all the time, we're going to open back up and you can come over there and see a lot of the science portrayed in our Discovery Center, including the globe that shows the whole Earth flooding in a 2-minute video.
These are some great questions. Give it up for all of these who gave good job, kids, and obviously adults. Well, we want to begin our Ice Age talk, and so we'll also have, at the end, if there's time, give you opportunities to ask questions.
All right, just like in the last talk, we talked about the same verse. Keep this in mind. 2 Peter 3 says, there shall come in the last days walking up to their own lusts and saying, these scoffers that come in the last days, where's their promise of his coming? And of course, at the end of this, they say, they deliberately forget or willingly are ignorant that by the word of God, the world that then was being overflowed with water perished. So people, again, that's one of the biggest things in the world today is they believe the earth is billions of years old, that all this stuff happened over millions and millions of years, And if there was a flood, it was just a local flood. Yet you saw the evidence for the global flood in my previous talk. Well, the end of the flood was very significant because volcanic activity was peaking at the end, and there was a reason for that. God had a plan all along, because if you're going to land an ark with all the representative animals on one spot in the world, and now the earth has all these continents separated like we see today, how do you get the animals back? So God had a plan, as we'll see, and that was the Ice Age. So the Ice Age was a conclusion to the flood. There was one global flood, and there was only one Ice Age. Even though secular scientists try to argue there was 4 or 5 Ice Ages, there's only really strong evidence for one Ice Age, and that's the most recent one. There's 2 world views out there. Of course, they have to believe in previous Ice Ages if there was an Ice Age, because they believe in uniformitarianism. Everything's uniform. The earth just keeps repeating itself. So there's always Ice Ages, they believe. If there's one Ice Age, there had to be more. If the plates are moving, they had to always be moving. But they really only moved once in 1 year. Now today, they're barely moving at all, because they were moving fairly recently, just like trying to stop a truck. When you got 60-mile thick plates moving around very rapidly, it's hard to stop them all. So they're still kind of moving around, but not very fast. But we believe that the present is not the key of the past. We believe there was a one-time event called the global flood and a one-time event called the Ice Age that happened after the flood and had a reason. Because God tells us in Exodus 20, in his own hand, he wrote these on the stone tablets he gave to Moses. He said, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all that's in them, and rested the 7th. So God made everything in 6 days, 6 real days, 24-hour days. There was morning, there was evening the first day, morning, evening the second day. Again, if these are 6 long periods of time, like some people try to say they were, not only are things out of order, because God created birds before dinosaurs. If you believe evolution, dinosaurs turned into birds, so it should have been the other way around. And God made the sun, the moon, and all the stars on day 4. And on day 3, he made the plants. So how do you have plants surviving for millions of years before the sun? And so people make all these crazy stories up, well, the sun was darker and lighter, and all sorts of crazy ideas, and just to try to fit what's called science into the Bible. But real science, the factual science that you just saw in the last talk, what the rocks really show, supports the Bible exactly. And so we'll see God's word is true. Science is not true. God's word is true. So let's talk about the Ice Age a little bit, revealing the secrets. Some of you down here in Texas, even though it's cold today, he's like, to me, this isn't cold. I spent Christmas in Michigan. That was a little colder, but it's even colder in Minnesota, North Dakota. Those people, they're hardy people. I don't know how they do it. The lakes warm up the water for Michigan, so it's not quite as bad as Wisconsin, for example. But how do we know there was an Ice Age? We'll look at some of the evidence from my home state of Michigan and even some down here in Texas that there was an Ice Age going on. What caused the Ice Age? And then we'll look at the biblical reason for the Ice Age. There was a reason. There's a reason for everything. God doesn't do things by accident. He has a plan. The Ice Age. So here's the northern hemisphere. There wasn't as much in the southern hemisphere. There was some. The mountains actually, in the Rockies, you go out there, you see these big U-shaped valleys. There was a lot of ice in the mountains as well, but most of these big light ice sheets like we see in Greenland and Antarctica, they all formed after the flood. And so really Greenland and Antarctica are remnants, reminders of that Ice Age that covered much of Europe, covered much of North America, and covered parts of Siberia. So there's the extent of the ice to some respects. That's a secular model that shows how much ice there was. There's a lot of sea ice too, but sea ice only gets 6 feet deep. You got to have land to build up big ice sheets. These ice sheets were a mile thick probably, and sometimes even deeper. So just like we see in Antarctica and Greenland, you need land to build up ice because snow makes ice. Lots of snow. Over time, it doesn't melt. Pile it on, pile it on, pile it on, pile it on. Eventually, the pressure turns that into ice. And we think this can happen very quickly under the right conditions. The Great Lakes themselves, where I grew up, were carved by glaciers. 4 of the 5 Great Lakes are the result of post-flood glaciers. So once you lay all the sediments down, then the ice came down from Canada, where it was the thickest. It kind of flowed south away from the thickest area. If ice is really thick here, like paint, you pour paint at the floor, it's going to spread out. Ice has a tendency to spread out. You keep adding more snow, it keeps spreading out in all directions. And one of the directions was coming south, and it carved all these lakes, and it followed the softest geology. The lakes are actually, underneath the lakes, there's all this salt and gypsum, really soft rocks. And they actually mine salt underneath Detroit. They drill down underneath the lakes and find these thick layers of salt. They're deposited in the flood. And so lots and lots of that particular material. And they named all these, the brief history of the Ice Age in Michigan. You have the Lake Michigan lobe, the Erie Huron lobe, the Saginaw lobe, where I'm from, that area, Saginaw. Right here, when you're from Michigan, you just hold your hand up, say I'm from here, wherever you're from. You can't do that in Texas, can you? It's like, what do you, make a Texas thing. Just say I'm from, there's only one state if you're from Texas, right? Alaska doesn't exist. See how it works? That's just a territory. And so, all right, well, moving right along, formed all these glaciers and carved out these deep areas. They're only a couple hundred feet deep for the most part. So most of the lakes are shallow, but there's different lake levels. We can see the lake terraces still where the lakes carved beaches at different levels. And this is one level. And the area where I live is all underwater here. And we see 50 feet of clay deposited during the Ice Age in the area I grew up in. So when we farm up there, if it rains a lot, it just sits there. They have to drain it off with pipes to drain the water off in some of these areas because of that clay. And you can see the lake levels drained off once or twice as the ice was melting back, and it carved a big steep channel. I don't know if you can see that in here, right up and through there. They went down about 200 feet between the lakes. From one side over here, as the water drained off rapidly, the other side, here it carved out what's called the Straits of Mackinac. And they had to build a suspension bridge, the largest suspension bridge in the Western Hemisphere, bigger than San Francisco, because they had to straddle that big canyon. So they put the big struts going up, straddling that canyon, put this big bridge in like the late 50s. So you can drive from the upper peninsula to the lower peninsula and vice versa. But it's all because they had to put that kind of a bridge in because they had to straddle that big canyon that goes down very, very deep, that carved. And then there's another level that moved up the Nipissing. These are local tribes. They named these lake levels after. But you can follow these ridges around. And you can see these lake levels on Michigan's biggest tourist trap, Mackinac Island. And there's advertisements for this in the summer, usually here in Texas, to come to Michigan and cool off and go to Mackinac Island. And there's no cars on the island. It's just horses and buggies and bicycles and fudge. They make lots of fudge. If you like fudge, you got to go there. It's like closest to heaven if you're a fudge lover you can get. But there's a little town down there, you take a ferry across from the mainland, and there's these lake levels, these ridges that are 60 feet high. There's a couple different lake levels showing this is the Nipissing level. And here you can see the Nipissing level. I'll show a little, kind of the arrow shows that notch. A lot of the buildings are built on that notch. The Grand Hotel is built on that first lake level. So you can follow these around the mainland as well. And you can see, on the mainland, you can see these Ice Age landforms. The lakes follow the direction that glaciers moved, and glaciers were kind of going south from the thickest ice, leaving these glacial lakes behind. They left these drumlins behind. You can see those areas that all kind of follow that same pattern. You can see these hills that are maybe 100 feet high, filled with glacial debris that almost look like the backs of whales. You see these across Wisconsin and Michigan and New York, all these glacial landforms that formed underneath the glaciers. And you see erratics, rocks that are way out of place. All over Michigan, you see rocks that are brought down from Canada that aren't from the rocks in the local area. Just like rivers transport rocks from great distances, glaciers carried a lot of debris. And when they melted, they just dropped those rocks, and they're called erratics. And there's gouges and scratches. You can't really see that one on the left very well, but it's a big gouge about this deep where the rocks scraped across the bedrock. It's exposed at the surface. You can see striations and things. There's striations and cames and big sand dunes where the land rose. As the glaciers melted, the land rose 400 feet in places in Michigan. So you have the Sleeping Bear Sand Dunes, National Lake Shore. You can go down, it's 400 foot high of sand. When you go down there, you find it's a lot harder to come back up. And it takes hours for some people to come back up. I did that once about 20 years ago, and I said, never again. But there's people that do it, going down. And it's amazing how hard it is to walk up sand for 400 feet. Every step you take, you're going back down. But that's because glacial rebound pushed those sand dunes all the way up. As the weight of the ice pushed the land down, as the ice melted, the land rose and pushed these terraces up into the air. And you can find moraines, these big hills that they ski on in Michigan in the wintertime. These hills are not mountains, but they're 300, 400, 500 feet high. in places. And you can see these over, try to put a picture in here. Well, it doesn't show up as well, but this is the Port Huron moraine, which comes around Michigan. It starts at Port Huron over here, and this side comes all the way around. So you're looking over here on this side now, south of Traverse City. And you can see they grow potatoes in that flat valley in between, very sandy soil. But you can see kind of the edge of it, you can see there's a ridge that's several hundred feet high. Well, that's the debris where glaciers had stopped for a while and were just melting and dropping stuff. And eventually there's a terminal moraine, they call it, the very farthest extent south. And some of that is in Nebraska and Kansas. Glaciers got that far south. Didn't get to Texas, but they came close. And Michigan's state fossil is the mastodon, a little smaller than a mammoth, because there's so many mastodon fossils that are found in the glacial clays and muds deposited. As the water is melted, there was a lot of runoff, a lot of local catastrophic floods as the ice melted and buried some of these critters. So these aren't